Audiences know who the 9 old men are. 9 key animators over the years who worked on all these classic movies, Peter Pan, Jungle Book, and so forth. But they had teachers too and mentors on Snow White. And those were the great men of their era who really taught the 9 old men the principles of animation. And Snow White really belongs to them more than anybody.
Mark my words, there's trouble a-brewing.
If you ask any of the 9 old men who they looked up to way back, who they said, this guy really has it, it was Bill Teitler. He was the guy who brought these raw emotions to the characters. I remember Ollie Johnston telling me that when he saw Teitler's work on Grumpy and how the emotions just seemed to ooze out of those drawings, it was acting that hadn't been done before.
Vladimir Teitler was a very emotional, powerful, large man with a big mustache. He was passionate about everything. He was passionate about animation, and he was one of the greatest animators that ever lived.
He was a man who had the ability to see these heavy characters who had some kind of physical, or in the case of Grumpy, physical and mental attitude.
You must be grumpy.
This is the man who would go on to animate Stromboli in Pinocchio and Chernabog, the devil, in Night on Bald Mountain in Fantasia.
He also did Dumbo, sitting in his mother's trunk, swinging, and had the tenderness to do something like that. So he had this tremendous range. He did the scene where Grumpy was resisting washing, and the other 6 dwarfs drag him over to this wash tub, this trough, to put him in there. It's sort of a tour de force of animation. You got this power of Grumpy twisting and turning and gyrating, and yet all these guys working as this amoeba-like unit, working him over there. Everything he does has total physical believability and yet great emotional power. One of the best animation artists of all time, really.
One of the great joys in Snow White is Freddie Moore's animation of the dwarves.
Mark Davis told me years ago, he said in those days, in those early Hyperion days, Fred Moore was Disney drawing. Fred Moore was this sort of child genius who applied at Disney Studios, not with a portfolio, but with some drawings that he had done on supermarket paper bags. And they impressed somebody at the studio, and he just rose. He was so young. He was just barely 20, I think, when he started there at the studio.
They used to say of him that he can't make a bad drawing. He was just a born natural.
He could not draw a line that was not charming. He could not create characters that didn't make you want to just know more about them.
One thing Freddie also was at the studio was a Mickey Mouse expert. If you remember the early Mickeys, he used to say a 50-cent piece and 2 dimes, you know, to trace the circle and 2 ears. But Freddie took that into the realm and saying, well, let's give that a little bit of elasticity. Let's say we can stretch the ears a little bit. Let's say that his mouth has some plasticity to it. He took Mickey's body and made it a pear shape. One of my favorite Freddie Moore's is a cartoon called The Little Whirlwind, where Mickey is battling a little twirling eddy while he's trying to rake leaves. And eventually, he was the first one to draw Mickey with whites in his eyes. So the Mickey that appears in The Pointer and Fantasia was based on Freddie Moore's designs.
Somebody like that who has this natural gift for a medium just comes along once in 1,000 years, I think.
Norm Ferguson, he had such a great staging ability, and he inspired me in a way that he could move things around without getting too complicated.
Many of the key animators on Snow White grew out of the shorts. Here's Norm Ferguson, who grows up developing personality in Pluto and goes on to do the Big Bad Wolf in 3 Little Pigs and then the Hag in Snow White.
You look at his groundbreaking animation of Pluto and how he made Pluto think in that famous fly paper sequence. And that was really Norm Ferguson, to really make a character, an animated character, stop and think and make the audience see that.
He came from New York. He was an accountant, but he loved theater. In New York, he used to go to the vaudeville shows. So if you look at The Witch in Snow White, which was modeled on a hammy performance in drag, there's a real vaudeville quality to the witch. She's very exaggerated. She does all these kind of yah-ha-ha gestures, old melodrama gestures.
I remember that scene when you see her for the first time. She has her arm over her face. She reveals it and stares right into the camera. I mean, that scares the popcorn out of you. Ferguson worked on The Fox and the Cat in Pinocchio, Honest John and Gideon, with the help of John Lounsbury.
It's a vaudeville duo. He influenced John Lounsbury, who became one of the 9 Old Men. So there did pass on his feeling and thinking about animation to a new generation. Snow White was animated by at least 3 people. One of them was Grim Natwick. And Grim Natwick was a revered and admired animator from New York. And he was an expert in the animation of the female character because he had designed Betty Boop for Max Fleischer. So Walt wanted him.
Well, I animated exclusively on Snow White, and altogether, our unit, we animated 74 scenes, and that would mean an average of 1 scene for every minute of the film, which is a very high average. And I suppose possibly 20,000 drawings or something like that.
Grimm was a legend in animation before he joined Snow White, and he continued to be. He lived to be 100 years old. And the party that they threw for him was amazing. It was like, you know, all the gods of animation had come together to honor the great Grim Natwick. Hamilton Ham Lusk was also someone who had a great deal to do with how Snow White moved and how she looked. He supervised the photography of the live-action reference footage of Marge Belcher that was used throughout the film.
And many people, I think, believe that Ham Lusk and Grim Natwick and the other artists who worked on Snow White were really the artists who held together this film, because they knew how to illustrate cute little animals. They'd done it hundreds of times in Silly Symphonies. They knew how to create comic characters like the Dwarfs and menacing characters like the Witch. All that had been done in Silly Symphonies as well. But the secret, the amazing secret, was that they cracked the business of creating a real person, a real character in Snow White. The character of Snow White is the character that holds it all together, a character who would move you to tears and to laughter.
Art Babbitt was another great animator, an important animator. He came on in the 1930s, mid-1930s at the studio. He encouraged his friend Bill Titler to come to the Disney studio, so we have him to thank for that. And he animated in Snow White the Queen.
I animated the Queen, all with the exception, I believe, of one scene, which was animated by Bob Stokes, and that was the scene of the Queen running down the stairs, where I tried to visualize a caricature of a vicious, jealous woman.
Art Babbitt is a very interesting person to study because I would have never thought that Walt would give him the Queen in Snow White. He wasn't one of the strongest draftsmen. He did cartoony stuff, just wonderful, loose, inventive animation.
He was the animator who had created one of the 4 major characters that were created for the studio. He'd created Goofy.
To go from Goofy to the realism of the Queen in Snow White, that's a stretch. But Walt liked to challenge people, you know, and rather giving him the cartoony assignment of one of the dwarfs, he said, why don't you try the Queen and see what you can come up with there? And he did great. The Queen is so subtle and withheld, which just makes her so powerful.
A marvelous job of timing and personality. The 9 old men were not the 9 old men then. They were young guys getting started.
You see in these great performances in this film the initial work of a bunch of animators who are yet to become the leaders of their profession at the Disney studio. Les Clark, Eric Larson.
Frank Thomas and Ward Kimball and Mark Davis.
The only one of the future 9 old men who had a position of great power because of the particular sequence that he worked on was Frank Thomas. He was in his 20s, and he was selected by Walt to animate the sequence at the end where the dwarfs are weeping. Now, this was a very unusual and difficult assignment, particularly for a young person.
To be able to get that sense of emotion and reality, audiences sobbed along with the dwarfs. That came out of Frank.
A fabulous sequence that inspired so many people. Animation could be serious.
The whole thing is just has a warmth and a glow to it that just hits you right in the heart. Disney got these great artists and that caliber of artists developed really profound, rich characters at that time where nobody else was doing that. So it was a very unique group of artists, who did this.